Welcome to We Gotta Talk, a live weekly talk show and podcast where we like to dig deep. From health to relationships to alternative lifestyles and more, the one thing you will always get is a deep dive. I'm Sunny, a 15-year veteran of TV news, freelance writer, blogger, mom of 3, and wife. But most of all, I'm just a die-hard oversharer, someone who's genuinely curious about, well, everything around me. And I can't wait for you to join in on these conversations that I promise will impact, inspire, and entertain you. Now, let's talk. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of We Gotta Talk. I am so glad you're here today. Today's topic is big and juicy, and I feel like it scared a lot of people away when I went on Instagram and posted about this earlier this week, because this is a topic that is taboo for many people. Pornography in and of itself is something that people don't want to admit to consuming, let alone talk about. But I wanted to do this topic of pornography addiction today because this is something that, whether or not we like it, will somehow touch most people in our lives. In fact, I was inspired to do this interview when I heard Katie Couric's podcast a while back, speaking with teenage boys about how pornography impacted their ability to have healthy relationships, how early our children are starting to see this, and how that distorts their expectations as they age and have partners. So this is a topic that we can dig into from so many angles. Today, we're going to discuss not only how to healthily discuss this issue with our kids, keep them protected to the extent that we should, but also how to deal with this when it comes to our partners. I know there are a lot of people out there who have found out their partners have been users of pornography and have wondered, is this cheating? Is this an issue? And how do you know when it becomes a problem? So today's guest is here to answer all of that and more. We did get a couple of questions too, so we'll get to those as always toward the end. But let me read the intro for our awesome guest. Sam Tielemans is a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's based in Las Vegas, Nevada. He's been doing therapy for 9 years. He's helped hundreds of couples, specializing particularly in helping them heal from the impact of pornography addiction. And actually, his podcast is debuting next week. So you guys have to make sure you listen. It's going to be called Couples Healing from a Pornography Addiction, and that is going to launch October 2nd. He is a husband, a father of 2 children, and we are grateful for his time and expertise today. So Sam, thank you so much for coming on We Gotta Talk today.
Hey, Sunny, it's really good to be here. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Of course. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. So I guess this is typical when you tell people what you do for a living, people are probably like, oh,
yeah. No, I know. Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's such a sensitive topic. And so people don't really know how to respond, right? So usually I'll just tell them I work with couples. So if they want to know a little bit more, but yeah, I'll tell them.
Okay. Yeah. And that is essentially what you do. Why did you choose to specialize in this particular issue? This is a very modern issue, it seems.
Yes. Okay, so when I was in grad school, it was a very specific moment that when I was in grad school talking to a friend of mine, he opened up and shared that he had a struggle with this. And I remember when he told me that, my thought was like, I need to learn how to, like, just like a voice came in my head, almost like a thought of like, I need to learn how to treat this because I'm sure I'm going to see it a lot in the church. So I'm a spiritual person. And not only is it in churches and, whether it's spiritual or not, I think people everywhere are struggling with this. There's like tens of millions of people across the world that struggle with addictions. So I remember having that very clear thought, I need to learn how to treat this. And so ever since then, my focus has been learning how to help people navigate this issue.
Not to generalize, but this seems like more of a guy problem. Sex and pornography addiction tends, in my mind, that could be sexist of me against my fellow ladies. Tell me if that bears out in reality too.
It's true. I mean, many women do struggle with it. There's a lot of women who do, but the majority, in terms of like data, there's more men that do struggle with it.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, there's so many places to start, but I guess we start with the obvious, which is there are so many ways to get video, pictures, connect with people because of social media and the internet now than ever before. Yep. So what interests me about this topic is when you're dealing with an addiction, say to a substance, you can physically remove yourself in some situations, in most situations, from the object of your addiction or desire. With pornography, with an addiction to this type of dopamine hit that this provides, it feels like it would be impossible to get away because we always have our phones in our hands, and what we can find with one click. So where do you start when a couple or a person comes to you and says, I have this issue, and literally, I don't know what to do because the internet is everywhere?
Yes, no, that's a really good question. And so I think one thing to keep in mind is that an addiction is nothing more than a way to cope with pain emotionally. So in other words, like it's a way to distract themselves. And so I think when I work with people, I don't focus so much on like, okay, let's put filters on your phone and let's like give you a little flip phone so you don't have access to it anymore. The goal is to really get underneath the behavior to resolve the reason why they're turning to it in the first place. And when you do that, then they can still have access to their phone. They can have internet access and watch movies and do everything that other people do. But the pull to go back to it is reduced and then eliminated when they address the core of the issue.
So what do you find is the common thread among people who claim that this is an addiction for them?
So most of the time when people struggle with this, it's because of like, I think there's two, if I were to funnel everything down to two things, number one, like people lack connection. And when we don't have a sense of connection with our partner or family members or friends, if we feel isolated, then that's a very, like, it's such a painful experience for us as people. As human beings, we're not meant to be alone. We're not meant to not have connections. And so when we don't have those, it just feels so overwhelming that we turn to something that we can just kind of change how we feel. So that's number one. Number two is oftentimes that people have like these really harsh beliefs about themselves, such as I'm a bad person, or I'm unworthy, I'm not good enough. And the pain that that causes to our self-esteem, to our psyche, it feels overwhelming. So that's just another very common reason that drives people to cope with how they feel.
Mm-hmm. What's a trait unique to a person who might be experiencing this that you've noticed? I know you said pain is an issue or a feeling of unworthiness, but it's such a very specific problem that an individual or couples would deal with. Is it always a disconnect in the relationship? And if so, like, where do you even start with that? Because it feels like you would have to do some backtracking to get to the point of how they landed there.
Yeah, no, I think for most people, so the average age of exposure to pornography is between 9 and 11, just because the internet's everywhere, right?
That feels so young.
It's crazy, I know. And so, yeah, it's like, so that's one element, right? So they're exposed super early, then they start to develop a habit, right? It's not like, a 12-year-old doesn't usually have a full-blown addiction. It's like they're curious. So they go and take a look and see what this is, and they talk to their friends about it. And like inherently, they feel like it's conflicting emotions like curiosity, but shock, because they're not ready to see that. They don't have the capacity to process that. So it just becomes overwhelming, but it still produces chemicals in the body like dopamine and oxytocin, all these feel-good chemicals. So if they're in a situation when they're young, whether there's trauma or they can't talk to their parents about emotions and they feel kind of on their own, this is a very easy way to just kind of forget about how they feel. So I think as that progresses, people get into relationships, and then without knowing how to, if they don't have the skill when they're young to talk to somebody else about how they feel, they don't magically learn that when they get married. And so when they're with their spouse, yes, they can have surface kind of conversations, but really letting them in and being vulnerable and telling them about some of their deepest fears and concerns and hurts. If they don't do that, they're still carrying all that pain, so that the same habit that they developed just carries on into the relationship, even though they're, we talk about connection. I'm talking more like on an emotional level. You can have a relationship with somebody and not connect with them. And I feel like many people are in that kind of a situation.
That's interesting. And I do feel like this conversation sort of dovetails to the people watching who are concerned about how this will impact their children, how to raise their children with a healthy use of technology, and then couples. So I'm going to kind of treat this as like two separate tracks that kind of merge into the same problem. But because you brought up the early exposure to pornography for our children, you said 9 to 11 is the average age. Let's start there. I think parents everywhere, first of all, just collectively choked on their coffee. Because, 9 is young. It was one thing when we were young and there was no internet, and the most you would ever find is a weird movie on Cinemax or
Yes.
HBO, like past 10, and
Right.
actually having millions of images that are on your phone. So let's start with a good way to talk with our kids about this, because you're saying this and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, have I missed the ball? Like, have I dropped the ball? Should I be talking to my young children about this? What are your thoughts on that? And at
So
what age
it's a good
start?
question. That's a really
Yeah.
good question. So there's a resource that's phenomenal. So the book is called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, and it's written by the name of somebody, Kristen Jensen, and it's such a good book because it tells parents what kind of language can you use when you're talking to a 6-year-old that they'll understand and start to know, like, okay, like we should be paying attention to this. So one of the things that she talks about, so I have a 5-year-old. We got the book, and I'm not some like, this is important. Like, I'm not some religious zealot that says like sex is bad and this, like, don't ever look at this stuff and this is terrible if you think about it. Like, it's not that at all. It's kids need to be aware of what's out there, because again, a 9-year-old, when they're exposed, because like what you said, like back when we were younger, it's like they might stumble across a magazine. It's a
Mhm.
static image. But now it's like so much of what kids see is violent. Kids have no way to process that. And so letting them know that there's things out there and what to kind of pay attention to, super important. And so when you're very, very young, if you have very young kids, one of the things that she says in the books is you can talk about some of the parts of our body that are private, and the parts that cover, the parts that swimsuits cover is what she says. Like,
Mhm.
those are private areas. Moms and dads can like help you, or doctors. Like, there's a limited number of people who can, like, they kind of what's the word to this? It's like there's only a few people who can help you, whether it's changing or
Right.
like
And I would
doctors.
even go so far as say doctors too. Like I say to my kids when they're getting their physicals, and of course their clothes are coming on and off and they're checking things. I'm like, the
Yes.
only reason that this is allowed to happen is because mommy is in the room and it's
Yep.
doctor, not because it's a doctor, because some doctors can do bad things too,
True. That's
because
true.
mommy is here. So, I mean,
I
even
like
though,
that even more.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Okay. So Good Pictures, Bad Pictures is the name of the book. So
Such a good resource.
are you talking to your 5-year-old about this already? And like, or are you just reading this book to her and kind of letting the author do the heavy lifting?
Yep. So yeah, I don't have to come up with, because I don't specialize in working with kids, right? So
Right.
I work with adults and couples. So I'm learning too, like, what's the best way to approach a 5-year-old? Because that's my oldest, so I'm new to parenting. So the author does such a good job laying everything out, so you don't have to come up with all these things that you know have to say.
Right. I love that. Let's
Yeah.
dovetail now let's move into the couples sort of part of this. I think we all like to think we're super evolved and we are very accepting of, anything that it's people's choice to do whatever they want to do. But I'm sure you hear from halves of couples that feel very deeply hurt by their partner consuming pornography extensively. How does a partner know when there is an issue in the relationship and that too much of this is being consumed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is one of the things it's so subjective, because for some people, looking at all is too much. For other people, if the husband or the person who's watching it is more interested in that than the actual partner. So I think it all depends on how, like, somebody's values, what somebody believes about pornography. So I think in terms of a relationship, whatever a couple comes in to see me, I work with their like way of seeing the world. So if the wife says, I don't want this in my marriage at all, then we start there. If she's like, I'm okay with it under these conditions, if we're doing it together or whatever else, then fine. Like, I don't have any agenda at all when I work with a couple. It's like, what do you need my help with? Then let's kind of create a path to get there.
I have to hop in there because I'm seeing this couple come in conceptually in my mind saying, the woman saying, I don't want any of it. I mean, I would imagine that a lot of guys are going to be like, okay, well, that feels impossible. Is it impossible? Or, is it too much for one partner to expect her or, his partner to completely stay away from anything that verges on inappropriate?
So that's a good question. So number one, I definitely think it's possible to avoid pornography. Like, it's not something you have to consume, right?
Mhm.
There's tons of other media. And usually when the wife says that, it's because she wants to be the person that he turns to.
Right.
She doesn't want him to turn to some image on the screen. because that often makes her feel uncomfortable and starts to compare herself. And there's no way to compare with these images that you see on the screen. It's like, it's not reality. And so there's lots of false expectations. So if she says, I really don't want him looking at this at all, it's definitely possible for him to not be involved with that at all.
Do guys ever just completely like, I sound like I'm painting such a horrible picture of men right now, but I'm asking because I have to feel like these people are feeling, okay, that's impossible. Here I am fully addicted or fully in a situation where I've been consuming this for X amount of days, months, years. What is the first step in pulling that back? Because it feels like this type of a scenario or our partners at two very differing ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on if somebody has like an actual addiction or if it's just something that they do when they're bored or want to release. Like, it just depends on what drives it. So if it's just like, my partner's not available, I'll just turn to this. That's very different than like, I feel awful about myself. I don't have anybody that I can like lean on. Then they turn to that to cope. So it just depends on which where somebody is with that.
So how do you tell if it's an addiction?
I think there's a couple of hallmarks. Number one is if somebody's tried multiple times and hasn't been able to quit. Like, that's kind of let me actually take a step back. So there's a spectrum, right? It's not just like, because sometimes people will ask, well, how many times do you need to look before you're addicted? And it's not so cut and dry. I think there's a spectrum between, like, at the very end of the side of it is no use, then use, misuse, abuse, dependence, addiction. So there's like a huge range. So you can't just say like, oh, my partner looks at this once or twice a month, so therefore he's addicted and I can't believe what's happening. It just all depends. Like, there's a big range. And again, there's two camps of people. One camp says there's no such thing as a sex addiction. There's no such thing as a porn addiction, right? The other camp says there absolutely is a thing such as addiction to a behavior, kind of like food addiction or whatever else the case may be. So it just depends on, like, okay, so having said that first, there's a big spectrum. In terms of like addiction, though, it's have you tried multiple times and have been unable to stop? Does it negatively impact your life in terms of relationships and spirituality and financially and self-esteem and your ability to achieve goals? So it just depends on how much this has an influence in your life.
So when you walk couples through this assessment, for lack of a better term, these are all very unique to their situation factors, it sounds like.
Yes, I think, yeah. And a lot of people that I work with, again, when I think of like heavy addiction, I think about the guy in the gutter who can't stop drinking alcohol and his life is completely in shambles. Most of the time, those people are not coming in. Usually it's people that has a hold on their life. They've been unable to successfully stop watching it. So they just need some help to figure out what's the block. Why do they keep going back to it? Because sometimes people think like, well, maybe it's the willpower issue. Maybe I don't have enough discipline. When really there's stuff underneath that keeps driving them to go back to it.
What, in the couples that you've worked with, what have you pinpointed as the turning point for people who have been able to heal from this? Is it that person who has the addiction identifying their underlying hurts, or what is the key to sort of unlocking the healing process?
Yeah, it's a great question. So definitely step number one, they have to be clear about why they're turning to it in the first place. And so once you're clear about that, let's say it is like a self-esteem thing, or they don't know how to let somebody in emotionally. They just have so many walls up. Once you identify what that is, then the path becomes clear in terms of how to heal. It's then, okay, let's get you to be able to start to open up and let your spouse in. Let's start there and sharing some of the things that's underneath the surface and talking about your pain in a healthy way instead of just like numbing it out and avoiding it, which is, again, the whole intention behind addiction in the first place.
Gosh, it sounds like when you start this is, like you have been saying, like a symptom of sometimes a greater issue. This could take people back into like a long period of therapy where they're probably addressing like family of origin issues or feelings of insufficiency that have been in there their whole lives. It sounds like a lot of work is what I'm trying to say. And like, if I were a person whose partner was struggling with this and I sat down in your office and you said, well, these are the kind of underlying issues, I would be nervous that it would take so long to heal what's really wrong with my partner that I'd be like, oh my God, just fix them already, or fix them. But I guess it's never that easy.
Well, and I mean, the reality is it does take effort. It takes energy. It takes intention.
Mhm.
it doesn't have to take, 2 decades. Let's say somebody comes in their 30s and they've been struggling with this for 15 years. It doesn't take then 15 years to like undo it. I think once people get the tools that they need and start to process things in a healthy way, they start to learn how to connect with their spouse. That's really why people are turning away. Like, they're turning to the substance or behavior because they don't have those things. So once they learn how to create that and how to have that kind of an experience in their own relationship in a healthy way, then it takes its place.
That's great. I mean, or if you were able to ballpark an estimate of the couples that you've worked with, how many percentage wise have healed and moved on from this? I know it's kind of difficult to truly understand because you're not living with them or you're not in their brains, but
Sure.
what would you say the estimate is?
Really high. I mean, there's absolutely hope. If there's anything that I want people to take from this, if they're in this situation, if their partner struggles with it, or if they struggle with it, like, I want people to know there's 100% hope that people do resolve this issue, and it doesn't have to be a part of their life forever. So it's super, super high in terms of like success rate. It's
Mhm.
just people feel very, very discouraged because if they've tried it on their own to stop and they think like, well, I should be over this by now. Why do I keep turning back to this? It's just, if they don't address the core of it, they're going to keep falling back into it. But when they do address the root of the issue, which again are a couple of things that we've talked about, like, then this problem goes away. It's not always nagging them. It's not in the back of their mind forever. So that
Mhm.
I want to leave people with the idea that there's hope.
Is porn ever a good thing for a relationship?
So again, I think it's very subjective. I think there's two camps. One camp says there's no place for it in a relationship. The other camp says, like, if both people are okay with it, then it doesn't harm. I think people in that camp will say it's something that you can do with your partner. It's a source of education. The people in the other camp say it's completely false education, though, and it really distorts reality and what healthy intimacy is. So it's very, very subjective. My personal view is that it is destructive. I've just seen it too many times to know that this is something that causes a problem, and it redefines expectations in a way that they can't be met. And so I don't think it's, personally, I don't think it's healthy. I think other people say like, well, it doesn't bother me, it's fine. Then that's perfectly fine too. But those usually aren't the people who come in to see me.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this before we went live, and I think my 21-year-old self was like, I don't care what my boyfriend, I mean, like, whatever you have to do, do what
Sure.
you do you. But, as you get into a relationship and you age together and you experience life together, you build a family together, you learn, you change together. I can understand why it becomes more of an issue. And it's not because, oh, I'm older and my boobs are saggy now, I'm more worried about what I look like. It's about exactly what you said. It's like, oh goodness, I didn't realize all of the ways that these images can infiltrate someone's mind, or that performative aspect of what you're seeing can ruin an intimate moment. But it
Definitely.
takes sort of getting to that point. Like, I feel like a lot of young people are like, what's the big deal? But then you get older and you're like, it potentially, I can see why it'd be an issue.
Definitely. And I think kids, again, teens, if that is their source of sexual education, like, that's the worst place that they can learn about what's okay and what's not okay. I mean, there's different statistics on this, but there's so much violent,
Mm,
like, aggressive kinds of pornography. And if
mhm.
kids are thinking like, oh, that's just what they do, like, oh, women like that, it's like, it's the worst place they can learn about sex. And so
It's
they
in,
take that with them. It redefines literally what they think about it, and like what's okay and not okay in their mind. So they take that into a relationship, and their girlfriend or their wife is like, it's just so different than what the reality is.
Yeah, I mean, it almost, I guess it's obviously never too late to fix anything, but if you're getting these cues and you're developing mind, especially like you reference like a teenager growing up and seeing this stuff, it feels like an impossible task to keep them away from those images. And the brain is developing so rapidly at that age. Like, it feels like any bad thing that they viewed will unintentionally imprint on them. That worries me. It worries me that our,
Sure.
our children are, and in some cases, it's not even them seeking it out. It's like you said, they're seeing it at a friend's house, or it's a pop-up that, Twitter. Like, can we talk about Twitter being the biggest porn hub in the world?
Seriously.
Oh my gosh.
I
I used
know, right?
in a newsroom and I'd be scrolling through my Twitter feed and like just boobs would pop up.
Yes. Yep.
I did not click on anything, I swear. But I mean, it does trouble me as a parent. I worry that those images will stick. I mean, we have the book that you recommended, this discussion that we sort of have with our kids young, but what do you suggest to, like, as our kids age? I mean, is this something we just consistently bring up and we're like, hey, by the way, if you've seen anything weird lately, that's
Yes.
not normal.
It's a great question. So yes, I can't recommend that book enough, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, because she talks about how to handle that. And it's not that you have to have this, it's gone, I think, from when we were young to having like the big T talk, like you have the one time sit down, you have the talk. It's gone from that to like lots of little T kind of talks. In other words, just like discussion. So it's not like you talk about it once and then you kind of look the other way. It can't be like that anymore. It's too prevalent. And so I
Mhm.
think the more parents can have this be a discussion that they have, it doesn't have to be on an everyday basis. But if this is a topic of conversation and you can help your kids understand that there are, again, like good pictures and things that we shouldn't be looking at. And so, again, I live in Las Vegas, there's billboards everywhere. And so I want to get out in front of uh, my daughter or my son being exposed to that and help them understand, hey, there's a time and a place for that kind of thing. And the best defense isn't to like put the visor down and tell them to look away, because
Mhm.
they're going to be exposed to it at some point. It's a virtual certainty they'll see it at some point. So you want to teach them and have them develop these internal defense mechanisms or internal ways of looking at things so that they're fully prepared that when they see it, they know what to do. They know what to think about it already. So it really it helps you as a parent to safeguard your kid. You can send them out into the world and feel confident they're going to be fine because you've prepared them.
Yeah, you're right. There is no shielding anymore.
No,
Absolutely.
there's no way.
It's unfortunate in some ways, but I guess you're right. It does force you to equip them and equip ourselves with the only tools that we need, which are internal and like that sense of value and self-worth and stuff. But man, it does kind of as a parent, it already is such an uphill battle. I mean, you worry about everything. And then, like I said, the sort of genesis of this interview was hearing these teenagers talk on a previous podcast that I listened to. And I thought to myself, oh my God, here's another thing that I have to,
Right.
worry about. It's like big and
Right.
bad out there. And
I know. Which is super unfortunate because it is like that's the world that we live in now. So we just have to then address and get out in front of. I think sometimes parents can be really scared to have these discussions because it feels uncomfortable. It feels weird. But I think knowing that the parent sets the tenor or the temperature for the relationship. If they walk into it feeling super weird and they don't know what to say, their kid's going to just pick up on that energy and like, okay, this is a weird thing. Like we can't talk about this. But if it's just very casual, and again, this is why that book is so helpful. It helps you know what to say, how to say it, so that when you have these discussions, there's a different energy. It's just like you're talking about something that's neutral, which is what we
right,
want. We want this
right.
to be a neutral thing, not this very scary thing for them.
Right. Shifting back to when you work with couples, what are some of the first questions you ask these partners to, each person in the relationship to determine what's really happening? Sorry, that's
So,
my landline. I'm one of the few people left in America that's only online.
seriously, so I think the first thing that I like to do is understand what's their experience. Like, how has this impacted each of them individually? How has it impacted their relationship? The more you have a sense of the like how they're internalizing it, because if one person comes in and says it's not that big of a deal, the other person says this is like wrecked my world, then you have to approach it a little differently than if they both say like I've got to get this out of my life, and she says I want this out as well, and we're willing to do whatever it takes. We just want to get rid of it. So it just depends on what their experience is, but I think understanding the impact that it's had is the first place to start.
Have you ever worked with couples who were in the exact same situation you just said, which is what, let's just for the sake of conversation, say it's the guy with the issue.
Yep.
Like, I don't see this at all. I don't know why I'm here. I mean, are you able to like right that ship or flip that one around?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Problem.
yeah, so I think the way to work with that is like, what's his ultimate goal with the relationship? Does he want to have a relationship where his wife is happy, where they're connected, where they can feel close to one another, to have a good sexual relationship? Is that, if that's the outcome that he has, then porn won't fit in that equation. And he just needs to kind of understand that, okay, in order for him to be with this particular woman, if he loves her and he wants to stay, and this is a deal breaker for him, he then needs to understand that this, if he wants a good relationship with her and to feel fulfilled and connected, this just has to be taken out of the equation. But he can still get what he wants ultimately, which is to feel loved, to feel like, again, like having a good relationship with her. Many people are willing to say like, okay, well, porn's not that, like, why would I give up my marriage
Mhm.
if like porn's the thing that's causing that damage? Again, there's the difference. Like so many people, so many women especially, have such a hard time wrapping their mind around, in a relationship, my husband struggles with an addiction, yet he says he loves me. They cannot reconcile those two things. And I don't blame them. I understand that, because if she says, hey, please stop, and he says, okay, I will, and then she finds out that he's lying and still looking at it, she's going to naturally think he doesn't care about me. But the reality is, if he's struggling with an addiction, it's not that he doesn't care. He just doesn't know how to stop. It's not as easy as put the laptop down or just close the browser. Like, it seems like it should be that easy. But if he's been, if this is a habit that's been developing over the course of years, it really isn't that easy. So he just needs the tools to be able to stop.
How long does it take to unwind that clock then? Say you have two willing parties, and again, using the husband as an example of the person with the issue, how many, because I know there are some very real chemical processes involved
Yes.
in addiction. So how long does it take to unwind that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. Some of the addiction researchers and other therapists, they'll say it takes about 90 days for the brain to reset itself. And so, which is like, it's not that long, right? It's not 15 years you got to sign up for this thing. It's like, if you do this reset, the brain can start to repair maybe isn't the right word, but rewire. The brain can rewire itself, and it takes about 90 days. Again, certain habits and old neural pathways. It's like the more you use something, the more effortless it becomes. So you can just kind of start to rewire things, but it takes about 90 days.
Why do you think there are so many people out there who have a really hard time understanding that pornography can be an addiction or sex can be an addiction?
I think
a lot of naysayers.
Yeah, there are tons of them, and that's fine. They can think that, or I think the reason why people think it's like so difficult for that to be an addiction is because it's natural. We're all wired for sexuality, where it's like that's the way that we're built. And so I just think it's an error to think that even if it's natural, it can't develop into something that becomes all consuming. Like, think about food, right? Food is natural, but people who have an addiction to food, or in other words, use it to cope with how they feel, and it becomes a massive problem in their life, and there are lots of consequences connected to that. Like, it's an issue. And I guess I'm less concerned. Sometimes when people come in, it's like, can you diagnose my husband? Is it addiction or is it not? And I guess I'm less concerned with the vocabulary. I'm less concerned with the word, because I just want to resolve what's causing it. So whether or not we call it addiction, when I work with a couple, it's like it's irrelevant to me, because I just want to know, like, what's driving this? What's underneath this? Let's resolve it and get you guys the tools that you need to really connect with each other. That's my primary goal.
Is there a difference between sex and pornography addiction?
I mean, I think it's a different, I guess, expression of it. It's the same as like alcohol, though, or drugs, or Facebook, or food. It's just another way that the deeper problem manifests itself. So I guess it's in the same umbrella with regard to it being a sexually driven thing, but it all comes from the same place.
That's so fascinating. I mean, God, we're all just like wounded kids walking around the world.
It's true. I know.
This makes me like I said before, like really like worried about raising kids, because I've laughed about this with my friends before. Like, everybody will make it to adulthood with some form of damage. It can come from your family, it can come from an experience that you've had in your life. And it's like, which one are you going to have? It's just
so true.
Gosh, it really is.
I think the thing that comforts me knowing is that, like, I don't have to, like, if as a parent, if the one thing that you keep in mind is that your kid feels loved and they feel important to you, that's the number one, like, antidote or buffer against everything that they're going to come into contact with in the world. So if they know mom and dad are a safe place, I can turn to them, they have my back, like, that's the safety net that is like so fundamental to who we are and what we need. And many people don't get that. So then they have to figure out, how do I deal with the world by myself, which is, again, why addictions can start to develop in the first place.
Yeah. Gosh, Sam, the irony of you working in Las Vegas cannot be lost on
Sure.
you in this industry and in that topic. I'm a big believer in like energy of places, and
yes.
Every time everybody goes to Vegas, it's just like sin. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Like, for better and for worse, it's
I know. Yeah. The
crazy
stuff that people struggle with. I know but again, like, this message of hope, it's no matter what people are involved in, it's all just a symptom of the deeper thing. And once you resolve that, like, the symptom goes away.
Yeah. I mean, I do want to hit on that a little bit more, offering that light at the end of the tunnel for people who may be dealing with this. So you would say to someone who is in the initial stages of maybe worrying that this is an issue in their relationship, what?
So if you're in an initial stage that this is a concern or you're worried about this, it's worth first talking to your partner and letting them know how it's impacting you. And sometimes you'll be met with understanding. Other times you might be met with like minimization, where it's not that big of a deal. You're overreacting. It's just everybody does it. But the reality is, if it affects her, then it's going to affect the relationship. Therefore, the quality of the relationship is going to diminish. So I think you start by having conversations and letting your partner know this is how you feel, this is how you're taking it, and seeing if they're open or willing to stop watching and not be involved in that behavior. If the answer is no, then I think having more conversations with regard to how, like, setting up boundaries. Again, there's a whole process to do this, but I think you set up boundaries then. Like if you can't give yourself to him emotionally because he's viewing this kind of stuff and it's causing betrayal and hurt, then I think setting up boundaries can be helpful. So for your own sanity, you can feel like you can create your own safety. You can feel like you can get your needs met independently of having to rely on him. Like you have other sources where you can find that on your own safety. So I think it just like starts with the conversation though.
Yeah, as it always does. I want to just put a note out there. I know this is a touchy topic, but if you guys are watching live and want to drop a question in, I know your face and your profile picture will be by the comment, but you can drop in any way, even an email during the live show here, which is we got to talk to you via Gmail, and our producer will catch it and let us know. But it's ironic because we were joking about this before we came on live, and I said I got some questions. All of the questions, the legitimate questions that I got, were about raising our children to have healthy ideas around sexuality. And all of the strange comments I got were like people like confessing their porn habits to me. Oh, good. I don't really need to know that. You know, I did hear from someone who was like, my partner and I watch it together, and it's a way for us to have some fun.
Yep. And I think that's when they're in the other camp of it's not a big deal to us. And again, I don't push any agenda, even though I personally believe relationships are stronger without it. Like I don't tell them, well, you guys need to stop. Mm-hmm. It's just if they come in and say like, yeah, this is a part of our relationship, we're not here to work on that, we're here to work on communication, then I don't even address the pornography. It's just like whatever you do and whatever works for you is perfectly fine. It's those people don't come in to address that issue though. It's something else they're needing help with.
Right. What are some of the most common questions? You mentioned one of them being, how do I know if this is an actual addiction, and kind of people hinging on that word in particular. But what are some other common questions you get from couples who are struggling?
The number one question is, why does he do it? The spouse or the partner cannot wrap their mind around the fact that they keep engaging in this behavior that's obviously causing damage and pain to her. So she cannot, it's so difficult in the beginning for her to get, why does he keep doing this? Why can't he just stop? And that's where I think people, the way to understand the answer to that question is to understand why the addiction in the first place. Like, that's a good question. Why does he do it? And again, the answer is not because he doesn't have self-control or doesn't have willpower or doesn't care. It's what's driving that. Like, I remember hearing somebody say, instead of asking why the addiction, ask why the pain. The more you can get into that and resolve that, then again, the symptom will take care of itself.
Right. That's fascinating. Are there any stories or outcomes that stick out over the course of the 9 years you've been working with couples that was especially poignant, or be it difficult or successful?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of people. There's one couple that I was working with where she came in and they'd gone to multiple different therapists who didn't specialize in this. And this is, again, such a narrow specialty. Because if you come in to see somebody who's like, oh yeah, it's not that big of a deal. Why are you so why are you overreacting? It just reinforces this message that she's crazy. There's something wrong with her. So I think there was a woman who came in and she had worked with other people, and she said that they had helped in certain areas, but with this, they'd never been able to help. And so helping her husband get the tools that he needed to resolve what was going on for him, and to help them know how to come back and repair the damage, because there's a difference between just avoiding a behavior that's destructive and like actively connecting and feeling safe and seen and loved. So helping him get the tools to stop the addiction, to then know how to comfort his wife and how to be there and support her. And so through the process, it's just such a cool thing to watch people learn how to have these really powerful moments together and where they feel safe and are able to create that. And so now they're in a completely different place because he was able to learn how to resolve the issue and then learn how to connect with her. She started to feel safe, and they're in a, they literally have a different life together now.
That's awesome. It really is.
It's cool to see. It's really cool to see.
What do you think of that phrase, once an addict, always an addict, especially as it pertains to this?
Man, I couldn't disagree more. Like, it's so there's, for somebody to have to struggle with this forever is just simply untrue. And the reason why people continue to struggle with this is because they're not addressing the core of the issue. Many times people will come to me and say, I've been in a 12-step group for 5 years, and I sit in there with these like veterans who've been there for 20, and they're like, yep, this is just a daily battle. When really that's not how it has to be. I think a 12-step group is good in terms of having a community for you to support you, but it doesn't address the root of the problem. And I think that's where this ideology of once an addict, always an addict comes from, is they just think like, well, I've been struggling with this for 30 years. This is just how it is. But I couldn't disagree more, because I've seen people go from unable to stop to not even thinking about it anymore, or it doesn't have to plague them because they're resolving, again, what's going on in the first place.
That's crazy. And the brain chemistry, the science behind these addiction patterns is fascinating to me too. Like you said, the 90 days it takes to sort of unwind an addiction. And I'm sure that differs depending on if it's a substance or
behavior or something.
Yeah. What did you learn? You said you were in grad school and decided to study this, that really surprised you about how and why our brains become addicted to certain things?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a natural, there's the reward center in our brain. It's like this primal, do what feels good, avoid what feels bad. Like at the base level, that's how we kind of measure all of our decisions. Is this going to increase pleasure or help me avoid pain? And so when somebody finds something that increases pleasure, naturally they're going to want to go back to it, because that's just how we're wired. We want these hits and these spikes of dopamine where like, oh, this feels great. And you can get that in so many different ways. Like you can accomplish a goal and get a spike of dopamine. You can have a good conversation with a partner, or play a sport, or do, something that you enjoy. So you want to turn back and do more of that. So it's there for a purpose. If it gets misused almost, where in a counterfeit way, you're giving yourself that spike, then again, like that's where this disconnect comes in, because you turn to this thing. It's it's like you get the real feeling, but it's an artificial source. So then there's no, the benefits of continuing to do that behavior are not there. So it's like it's a false way to get that reward. And it's a very easy way to get the reward, which is why, again, when there's the path of least resistance and something feels good, it's so easy to just kind of loop and continue to do that.
Yeah. I mean, well, gosh, if you can have meaningful progress with people in Las Vegas, of all places, I know I keep coming back to that. Like, I know porn is everywhere. It's on our phones, whatever, but it really does. It just gives me hope for people who might be struggling with this.
Yes.
Did you watch or read the book Defending Jacob?
No, I haven't heard of that, actually.
It's like, I don't want to spoiler alert anyone, but it's the story about this boy who's accused of murder of another teenage boy in his high school, and in the courtroom scene, they are trying to get into his mind to see if they can paint him as a killer or as a good guy. And the line of questioning starts to center around the type of pornography that he was watching. And it was this cutting porn, very physically violent and insane stuff. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I didn't even know that this level of depravity existed. I mean, that it does, but this,
Sure.
I mean, does it ever trouble you? I'm sure it does. The types of things that people are consuming too. And I'm sure there are people out there who have noticed their partners being attracted to a certain type of pornography that's especially disturbing and violent. And
Yes.
I guess the follow-up question is, how do you unwind something like that that's not just normal sex, for lack of a better term?
So and it's insane. All of the stuff, it's the rabbit hole you can get lost in. If people come in and tell me that they watch certain things, there's so much out there that's just so negative. And so I think, again, this is a part of where I take comfort in this framework that I have, where I don't have to spend 6 months talking about the issue and the specific thing that they're looking at. I think, so there's a book by the name of Unbroken by an author who says that the type of pornography or the type of behavior that somebody engages in is a window into their unresolved issues. That just kind of like leads the way. So for instance, I remember working with somebody once, and he said like his ultimate fantasy was to be on a motorcycle with a blonde girl, go off to a secluded place and be able to have sex there. And once we started to unpack like what's the intention, what's the rationale for that, he said like when I was in high school, all the cool guys, all the jocks, all the people who I wasn't got the blonde girls. So it was almost like this, it played out as like, I want acceptance. I want to feel like I'm somebody. I want to feel like I'm enough. The brain kind of wrapped this scenario around how you achieve that, which is not true, right? It's just like this idea of if I get this, or if this kind of girl likes me, that means I'm enough. So it kind of just speaks to the woundedness that we all, like you said, we all have a wound somewhere in some area of life. And I think oftentimes those fantasies can directly connect with what they need ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Gosh. Well, we are about to wrap up. So guys, if you have any questions, do drop them in now. But I want to end on a happy and upbeat note, Sam. So give us your best course of action. Let's put it this way, because you told us what to do or the discussions to have if you think this is potentially an issue. So let's end on saying, is there a way to like safe proof your relationship? Or is there advice you give the couples you work with who are healed on how to stay on a good course?
Yeah, great question. So the number one thing that couples can do is learn how to develop a connection with one another and be able to truly let the other person in and start to be more vulnerable and talk about some of the things that are, things that they're thinking about, some fears, worries, concerns, hurts. The more you can have those kinds of discussions with your partner, not that you have to be crying every day and talking about that stuff, but just really letting the other person know more about who you are and creating this safe place for acceptance of the person that you are. Like the more couples are able to do that, that's the number one way to safeguard the relationship from anything else, whether it's somebody else coming between them, whether it's a behavior or a substance. Like creating that acceptance and connection in the relationship is by far the most effective thing somebody can do.
Awesome. Well, you are a wealth of information, Sam. I'm so honored that you took some time to spend with us today talking about this really touchy subject. Can you tell us where we can find more of your work and how we can connect with you?
Yes. So my podcast, like I said, is coming out, which I'm super excited about. It's going to be next week. You can find out more. You can contact me on my website, healingcouples.org. And so there's different information and things on there. And then I'm going to be putting a link for the podcast on the website.
Great. And are you going to be interviewing couples live or on the show ever?
So, yep, I just had an interview last week with a wife of a person who had struggled, but they're on the other side now. So she actually goes out and gives presentations and things. So yes, I definitely want to have guests and people who are on there as well, sharing their stories.
I love it. Gosh, I'm all for a person who likes to lift the veil on these things. I feel like, people shy away from these topics, but we can't. We have to be a little comfortable being uncomfortable, and your work is a testament to that. So thank you again for spending time with us.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate you having me on the show.
Thank you
so
much.
Thank you.
Bye. Wow, guys, that was so enlightening and so great. I want to thank you to anyone and everyone who sent in thoughts/questions beforehand. We did get to all of them. And like Sam said, you can find him on his website. Make sure you tune in his podcast, which debuts October 22nd. So next week. And yeah, that's it. This is the point of the podcast where I say, please, if you enjoyed this show or you found any worth or value, I truly, truly would appreciate it if you would go into Apple Podcasts in particular, leave a 5-star rating, leave a review. I would be incredibly grateful. That helps to get this show out to people who would find it useful and helpful. And I would be really super grateful too. Thank you guys so much for listening to and watching this episode of We Gotta Talk. I will, of course, be back next week with more good stuff. Take care of yourself, be well, and I'll see you soon.